Hello, everyone, and welcome to another meetup of Romania Power BI and Modern Excel user group. This is the last session of the month and the last session for the year. Thank you all for joining this 42nd meetup of Romania Power BI and Modern Excel user group, and thank you for spending your time here just before the holidays, learning together with us when you could do anything else and be anywhere. Welcome to another session presented by someone with lots of Power BI experience, sharing some knowledge with us, Antony Catella. Thank you, Antony, for accepting our invitation. For our newest members, my name is Cristian Angel, and together with the second Cristian Prifti, we will be your host today. Feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and stay up to date with future meetups and different other topics related to Power BI. Today's meetup agenda will go really quickly through it. We are on the welcome and the overview part now. I'll quickly present you the next meetups. Then we'll have the feature session with Antony, a short Q&A at the end. Then we'll have the Enterprise DNA Raffle, and I'll tell you more about it in a bit. And then wrap up and close the recording and stay for chat for whoever wants to stay a bit more. General house rules. Please make sure that during the session your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. Type your questions or comments in the chat area and prefix the questions with a Q so we can spot them easier. If you have any problem with the internet connection, please drop off and join again. Teams is recording. And speaking of recording, this is the pinpoint that I had, Antony. Please be advised, everyone, that the meeting is recorded, and who doesn't want to participate in a recorded meeting that will be published on YouTube, this is the time to drop off and check the recording when available. So, future meetups. In January, next year we'll have again 2 sessions per month, one in Romanian, one in English. In Romanian, we'll have the first session of the year will be on the 11th of January with Alex Badiu, Enterprise DNA expert. And he'll be doing his first presentation in Romanian, which is pretty cool. Then it will be a Power BI session. Then on the 18th of January, we will have Elena Draculevska with another Power BI visualization session. Then on the 15th of February, we'll have a Romanian session again with Gabriel Cheva, senior trainer from ETA2U here in Timișoara, about modern Excel. And then on the 29th of February, we will have the next English session with MVP Parv Chana from Canada. It will be a Power BI session, but the details are not set yet. So if you are here, then you are members of ROPAG, you'll get the notifications as soon as I publish them, as soon as I make them available. We were talking about future sessions, but almost all of our previous sessions are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel here, bit.ly/ropag_history. If you want to check any specific session, please go to our YouTube channel. Even there, you can subscribe and stay up to date with everything that we are publishing. I said earlier about Enterprise DNA. Since August 2021, Enterprise DNA is the primary official sponsor of ROPAG, offering for each English-speaking session 2 full annual Enterprise DNA memberships, total value about $1,000 monthly basis, free of charge for the members of ROPAG. which are attending the live sessions like you are attending today. In order to participate and to get one of these two memberships, please scan the QR code or go to the URL ropag42, bit.ly ropag42, or the other one. Fill up the form. You had the time to scan the QR code. If you hadn't had the time to scan it, don't worry. I will put the link in the chat during the session. So, coming back to our meetup today, thank you again, Antony, for taking the time to come and present to our user group. You know, I saw your session before and I loved it. And I was sure that all of our members will also love it and will learn something new out of it. And thank you for taking the time so close to the holidays. I know it's not easy, and but as we said before starting the recording, probably this is the last session that you'll have before holidays. And thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us. For who doesn't know Antony, he's a senior BI developer, a BI consultant from UK with lots of experience in Power BI. And best of all, he's my friend. We know each other for a few years now. We met online as part of SML, Saturday Morning Learning, a group of Power BI fans, like who we like to say. That we are meeting every Saturday, 1 hour before the live stream of Adam and Patrick from GuianaCube. We've also met in person at SQL Bits for the last 2 years in a row, and we also had some drinks over to my house when Antony visited Romania this last summer. Thanks again, Antony, for coming to Ropag. A few words about you, and the stage is yours.
Cool. Thanks, Christy. Yeah, no, always a pleasure to come and do these. I enjoy doing them, and always find them good fun, I must say, and always like sharing what I've learnt, and hopefully people will take away some things that they can go and implement in their own setups. Can you just make me presenter again, because I can share then?
Yeah. How come you're not?
I don't know. You've obviously killed me off as a presenter. There we go.
I know. I had both you and Christy before. So.
I think obviously your team. So right, can you see all see the screen?
Yeah, visible.
Great, cool. So anyway, as Christian said, I'm a BI consultant. I work for a consultancy in the UK. Most of our work is actually working with non-profits around the world. So we tend to work with your sort of biggest non-profits, so your charities around the world, and we do a lot of benchmarking benchmarking projects with them. So I am obviously very passionate about Power BI. I love the software, love how it's always changing, and that's obviously how I've met these brilliant individuals and good friends as well. So I love my mountain biking and my baking. I haven't quite got to be baking Power BI related things yet, but there's always a time that'll come along. My LinkedIn URL is on the screen there. If you want to be free to follow me or hook up with me on LinkedIn, it'll be really good. Always enjoy. And if you've got any questions and stuff afterwards, drop me a message. Quite happy to give you a shout. Right, let's crack on. So what we've got is that there are people on here who have heard this and stuff before. I hope that there'll be some of the things that they certainly part way that they have seen, but there are a couple of other things that I've added in at the end. So I hope it'll be some learning for everybody concerned. So what we've got is that this came out of a situation at work where what we do is we gather in the data from a whole lot of entities, these charities around the world. And what they've got is that they'll supply us with a whole lot of data. And as part of this process is that once we've actually processed that data, we then want to put that data into a Power BI report that it's not actually, there's less sort of reporting on the actual data. It's more being used as an actual auditing tool for these charities. So what they're actually doing is, it's more looking at the sort of data quality analysis. And I'd seen this done many times before, where people will audit their CRM data, and so they'll check for data that hasn't got information and things like that. So we were doing this. Now, what we used to do is we used to actually have an Excel spreadsheet or an Excel file that we'd load some data in, and we would then send an Excel file to each entity that was sending us data. Now, obviously, we know the challenge with Excel is that it can only hold 1 million rows of data. So that was a bit of an issue. But obviously, we wanted to bring that into a Power BI report. So I've used the Contosa sales data, because that obviously at least that's at least it's easier to understand, and I'm obviously using data that isn't part of the company. So what we've got here is that we've got aggregated data for all the customers and some of their associated attributes. Now, we'll get onto some of those attributes just now. And then we've also got all the sales transactions that are associated with those customers, and all those sales transactions have been aggregated. So it's not individual rows of data; it's just been aggregated for both tables of data. So what we've got is that if we look at I'll just increase this upwards a little bit, so hopefully people can see. So the basic data model that we've got here is that we've got a fact customers table, we've got a fact sales table. The customers table has got 5 dimensions attached to it. And on the sales table, we've got 3 dimensions associated with the sales data. So that's where we are starting. That's our starting point in terms of the data model that we've now actually got. So if you think about this, is that you may have the situation where, how on earth do we actually visualize this data? So you may have a report user who comes along and says, but I want to look at every single permutation of your actual of your data, because take, for example, the situation we've got where you're wanting people to audit their data that they've sent to us. So we want to be able to give that information that you're going to have some charities who are going to want to actually look at the data in one lens, and you're going to have another charity or another user who's going to want to look at the data in another lens. So, for example, if we look at the customers table, on the customers table I've created 4 different measures for the customers, and for the sales, I've got 5 different measures. So, for example, if I wanted to actually visualize all of the different permutations for the customers table only, I'd end up with 100 different charts just to visualize all 100, different permutations of the measures and the dimensions. And on the sales, I'd have to create 45 different charts if I wanted to provide every single permutation to the users. So I thought to myself, hang on, this is a hell of a lot of permutations that somebody or someone may want to use. So this brings us into field parameters. Now, I've sort of fallen in love with field parameters. I love the flexibility that they actually give you. So obviously, field parameters will allow you to dynamically change the measures and or your dimensions being used on your visuals within the report. So you can actually change in and out measures on a visual. You could actually change your x-axis, and or you could change your legend as well. So obviously it gives your report users the full flexibility to view the data in whatever sort of format they want to actually look at it. Now, one of the interesting things is that field parameters came out, I think it was about July, August last year. So they've been still in preview. for most probably 18 months or so. So if people, are new to field parameters on the call, is you just need to go into field file and then options, and then within the options here, there's a preview feature setting, and you can just turn on if you just turn on the field parameter settings here, and then once you've done that, press OK and come out, and then it'll most probably ask you to restart the software, and you'll be able to have the flexibility to be able to create your field parameters. So if I'm wanting to use field parameters, so in this situation here is that I've got a very basic situation where I've got a visual. I've just got a number of customers on it, and I've got the row at the x-axis that I can easily switch in and out of. So for example, it can switch between first purchase month, can switch to first purchase year if I want, gender. So you think about this as where if I had to create just this simple chart, I'd have to create at least 6 variations of this, possibly a 7th, because this option here, the none, will actually not show anything on the actual x-axis. And you do get people who actually do want to visualize, look at just the actual grand total for things. So how do we actually go and create these field parameters? So what you need to do is go to the modeling tab here, and then in the modeling tab, there's an option which is so under the parameters, there's an option for fields. So if I go into fields, this will bring up a dialog box here. What I'm going to do is just put an underscore to this parameter. You can give this name whatever you feel like it to yourself. You can give it a distinctive name, like, the particular, I tend to use things like, if I'm going to be using field parameters on the legend, I've tended to create my field parameters table, and I'll call it legend, I'll call it measure, an x-axis, or you might want to call it column, row, metrics, whatever you want to call it, but it's whatever you'd like to call it. So give it a name, and then on here is that I can just actually drag on any particular dimensions that I want into the field parameter table. And also too is that I can also drag on any other measures that I might have as well. So for example, is that if I'm wanting to, is that in actual fact, I can actually drag a dimension and a measure into the same field parameters table, which I sort of found that out by chance because I thought they had to be sort of specific to dimensions only or measures. And I suppose it depends on what you're trying to achieve. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stick with 2 dimensions in here, and then press create, and it'll create myself a slicer on the page here, and I can now actually use that within this actual chart itself. So if I go back to the data, go to my field parameters table here, and go and add my field parameter onto my chart into the x-axis. So I'll drag the parameter into the x-axis, and now I can view things at gender. So I'll select just the gender here, or I can switch around to occupation. So it's as simple as that. Very, very easy to actually do. So if I go on to the sort of next level of field parameters, so this is where the interesting part came in to the project that I was working on, is that I wanted to have a setup where people, like I said, had any sort of variation that they actually wanted to select within this Power BI auditing report that we had actually created. So if I look here at the customers page, so I've got all the measures, the 4 measures that I was talking about in this slicer for my measures. I've got the legend or column in the matrix, and I've got the x-axis as the row on the bottom cluster column chart here for people to actually use. So whatever people want to actually do here, they can actually they can actually select that onto the chart. So if you think about it earlier, is where I said you had 100 different permutations that people might want to do in terms of the number of charts. So I've got a situation here where I've actually got 5 visuals on the page that actually give you those 100 permutations that you might want. So it's very, very flexible in actual fact. And in actual fact, there may be even more permutations if you think about all the different sides of things that you might want to do. So for example, in this situation here, I might want to actually select two metrics, two measures that'll show on the actual in the top visual. So if I wanted to create a sort of static chart, if you want to call it in inverted commas, that would be another permutation, because that's another different variation of just literally measure times legend times the x-axis. So that's a really nice, cool feature about it. Now, the other thing as well that I really like about the field parameters is that within here is that I can select multiple options on here. For example, on the x-axis here, I've got the legend fixed to a single select at the moment because I didn't want to have the facility to be able to have too many options for the column of the matrix. It just becomes very complex and very difficult for people to actually then try and do things. But they can still slice and dice it because the options in the legend also exist in the x-axis as well. Now, in the matrix here is that if I drill down into the matrix here is that I've actually got the, it starts off at the gender, it then drops down to the actual first purchase year, then the marital status. Now, the nice thing about field parameters, which is the built-in functionality with field parameters, is that depending on the selection that you make in your slicer will change the order in your hierarchy here on your matrix, or even on my clustered column chart or any other chart. If you're building in a hierarchy on that chart, it'll change the order of that hierarchy. So for example, at the moment, I'm going to start with first purchase year, then I'm going to select marital status and then select gender. It then switches everything around in the matrix, so I can view it in a slightly different lens. And even in the chart below here, if I start drilling down here, is that it'll then start dropping down the order in which I actually wanted it to go, depending on the selection that I've actually made within the slices. So that's a really nice feature that I love about field parameters. And then obviously on this situation here, which is what I've done, is that I've also got the option here where I can actually also, not have an x-axis dimension if I don't want. And I'll get back to that, how I set that all up just now when we get to them. Now, one of the key things that I did want to point out here is that if you look here on the right-hand side in the filters on the page here, there's actually an attribute here called isCustomer. Now, this comes back to what I'll get to just now, is that it was a way of being able to filter the measures, legend, and x-axis, so it would only visualize, in the slices, it would only show you those particular options that had a specific attribute of customer. And I've got exactly the same thing on the sales page. There is also another one here, which is also attribute for sales. So it does exactly the same thing. It filters out the measures, legend, and x-axis, so it'll only display those ones that are pertinent to the sales data. So now you may ask, well, how did we get around setting this all up? So what I was going to do is run through how the actual data model is set up. So one of the things that a lot of people, I've encountered along the way is that people didn't think that you could actually create a data model using field parameters, that they thought they'd have to just sit as a standalone table within your data model. So for example, on my data model here is that I've actually got within the actual entire data model for this report, I've got the data model that is all the facts and dimensions, but on the right-hand side here, I've actually got another little data model that is to do with my field parameters that I'm actually using. So what I've got here is that if we look at this particular one to explain it, and then I'll explain how I got to build each of these components, is that we've got an x-axis field parameter, table, we've got a legend field parameter table, and we've got a measure field parameter table. There is also another table on the bottom right here that is also linked to the measure table that gives a definition of each of those measures that I actually display on each of the charts as well. So users who are using it know exactly what that measure or metric, actually what the definition is of that metric. So the other thing as well is that I've then got 3 bridge tables. So I've got an x-axis bridge, a legend bridge, and a measure bridge table. And then I've got this third table sitting up at the top of the hierarchy, if you want to call it, or the top of the data model, that I've just called a link table. Yes, it is another bridge table, but I wanted to try and keep the names of them slightly different, so it was just a little bit easier to explain how I actually created the data model. So I've got this link table up the top that is then linked to each of the 3 different bridge tables and then feeds down into the field parameter tables themselves. So how did we go about setting all of these up? So what we've got here is that if I start out and look at each of the field parameter tables, first of all, so the legend one is that I'm not sure if people can see that clearly. I'll sort of zoom in a little bit here, and so is that clear enough?
Would help.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Cool.
A bit of zoom would have helped. It's okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah. If you go a little bit to the left, it's perfect then.
A little bit to the left. Cool. There.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, sorry about that. It's the joys of okay.
Zoom it.
So is that fine?
Yeah.
There we go. Is that all right now, Christy?
It's not completely visible, the
Okay.
left side.
There now.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Cool. Much better.
Right. So what you've got here is that you've got a situation where at the top here, I've got the actual different fields. So within this legend field parameter table, you've got this first column, which I've called legend. Now, this is this column will generally get the name of the field parameter table that you've actually given it when you create it. Now, you can actually change the names of these fields once you've actually created the field parameter table, and it still functions, so there's no issue with that. Then you've got the legend fields column, which is the name of the, in this instance, the name of the dimension table that it's actually coming from. The legend order, which is actually the order in which each of these different options will appear within the actual slicer on your page. So these first three fields here are the standard 3 fields that get created when you create a field parameter table. But what you can also do is that you can actually go into the this here, and you can actually go and edit the field parameter table. So what I'm going to do is just go into here, and it's just as simple as actually adding something else in. So I could change the legend order on this particular row. I could then go and change the values of here. I could go and create another column in here. It could be a number, it could be a piece of text that I wanted to add into here. So it's a great thing, but what you will need to remember to do, though, is make sure that you've got exactly the same number of columns for every single row that you're editing, because what will happen is that it'll come up with an error message, and it'll Power BI will say that there's something missing within there. But what I ended up doing here is that I've got my first column that I added in was a column to indicate that this particular dimension was a customer dimension. And then I've also got a second column to indicate that this dimension belonged to my sales. So I could then use these in the next instance. Now, the other thing as well that I also did as well is, if you look at the legend order side of things here, is that I actually have used a number range here from 21 through to 31 on this particular instance here. And each of my different tables, I created a different number range. And there's a reason for that, which I'll get onto just now. Now, the other thing as well with the field parameter tables, you can also go and add a calculated column. So this here is a calculated column that I created at the end here, which is just taking the first name of, which is just taking the name of the first column and adding in a calculated column. And I'll explain later why I ended up doing that. So that's the legend table. The measure table is very similar. It's got the same sort of construct to it. But what I did here is that I added in an additional piece of, I added in a couple of other columns here. I've got a column here, which I've called type. So if you can, so if I show you back on the report itself, is where I actually broke up my measures so I could categorize them. So I've actually categorized my measures that are absolute values, so essentially are a whole number. So things like number of orders, total sales amount, versus my ones which are ratios, where I'm actually comparing, doing a division of some sort to get an average or something like that. And the reason I wanted to do that was that in my production report, I've actually got 100% column chart as my chart at the bottom. And so when you do that, is that I wanted to set it up that when you selected a ratio measure, the 100% column chart was blanked out, because a ratio and 100% column chart does not make any sense mathematically. And so that's why I wanted to subdivide my measures into different classifications. Then I've also got a clustered column chart. I've got a calculated column at the end of this table that, again, takes the name of the measure. What I've also done, I've also created another calculated column at the end of this table, which I've actually extracting the name of the measure from this measure fields here, because this number of customers is actually the name of the measure that I've actually created in the report. So, for example, this row here is that I'm extracting the name of the measure and including it in this calculated column at the end here. And I'll explain why I did this and what it was used for later on. Because one of the beauties about field parameter tables is that you can actually go and change. So this name of the measure, this first column here, you can give it whatever name you want here. So, for example, I've actually given a name where I've actually added in an asterisk, hash sign rather, at the description of the measure that appears on the slices, but the actual name of the measure doesn't actually include a hash sign. So it's really useful that you can actually make your measure that appears within your slicer bespoke, because one of the things that you may actually end up happening is, for example, in some of my reports, I'm actually using exactly the same dimension field, but I've actually got it twice within my field parameter table, because on certain situations, I might want to display a different text value depending on what I'm actually doing. So I may have a customers table where I've actually got, for example, a purchase year. So, for example, in the customer table, I wanted to actually use first purchase year, whereas in the sales table, I'll just use purchase year. But they'll be linked to the same dimension table, but I can use two different names. So, how did you rename the additional columns from Christy? How did you rename the additional columns? Yeah, so basically to rename them, once you've created them up at the top here and you've edited them, is that what will happen is it'll end up creating a column that's just called value something. So it's normally value 1, value 2, value 3, value 4, etc. Is if you double click into the header of the column, you can go and change it to whatever you want it to be. So I happen to change that to customer that I actually wanted.
Can you show the most simple version that you've built?
The most simple one.
Table.
There we go.
The first one.
There we go. And so there, the simple one is, I'm going to add another column into here just to show you what actually happens. And so
the table.
And in this instance here, so I've edited that. I've added in an extra column now. So now I've created an extra column now within that table. And I double click into there, and I've created a column new into there. And it's as simple as that. And so now I end up with another column in my field parameter table, and it's called column new. Yeah, and so you can just rename it to whatever you're wanting it to be. And I could just carry on the same process here. So I could add in another column here, depending on what I'm actually trying to do. So add another one in here.
Basically, you're putting only the values inside the column, and the DAX table it's automatically assigning a value number for that column that can be renamed.
Yeah, it's automatically just creating that. And so the same thing here is that I might want to add in a text option that I might want to use to classify my my stuff. You know, my particular, in this case, the dimensions in this particular table. So I've added some text values, and it's created another column called value 6 because I'd started value 5. It's now gone to value 6. I can just go and rename those values to whatever I'm actually wanting to do with that.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
If you are using a select value out of this new created column, does it work?
Yes, it does.
Cool, because there was a question from Christy before, actually mostly a wish. It would be nice to have the order of the selections when you did the selections in a certain order, to have it displayed somewhere. And I was thinking maybe we could use a measure with selected value and maybe a concatenate X and put it as a tooltip.
Yeah,
if it works.
So
but I didn't know if selected value works on this type of columns.
The only column selected value will not work on is the first column.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
The first column that I'll get onto that later on as well, but the first column that gets generated with a field parameter table is the only one that you cannot use selected value on. You can use another permutation, which Mark and Alberto have shown, where you can use concatenate X and various other permutations that you can use on the first column that gets generated, and it's all to do with the underlying mechanics around the creation of field parameters within Power BI. But I've actually I've seen it where people have used selected value on the parameter fields, so the second column. And I've also seen another one where what I generally do now is I'll create another calculated column at the actual with it, because then I find that I can then be able to do certain other things that at least I've then got freedom to use whatever other DAX functions I want to use on that calculated column without having to think about various issues.
Just like Nikos is saying in the chat, we could use max or min or whatever if we have a single column.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you.
You can also do that as well. So that's how easy it is to actually edit the field parameter tables. So this is the measures table. As I said, I'm extracting the text of that particular measure. Then if I run down very quickly to the x-axis, exactly the same methodology as the legend. But again, like I said, is the order here of the x-axis has got a different numerical sequence that I've actually used for it. And I'll show you why in a moment now. So when we get to the legend bridge, very simple. It's just a DAX table, just taking a distinct on the legend order that's coming from the legend field parameters table, which will give me my numbers that I'm looking for. Same thing with the measure bridge table. It'll get my numbers from that measure order column, and exactly the same with the x-axis bridge. Then in terms of the link table that I was talking about earlier, so if I take it back to the actual data model itself, so this link table that I was talking about here is, if I go back to that one, this is this row measure legend table that I created, which is again another calculated table. And where what I'm doing here is that I'm actually union creating a table here where I'm actually unioning all the different columns from the actual field parameter tables. I'm taking the order number, I'm creating a column called attributes and assigning it customer, depending, and then the attribute value that it came through from that the customer column that I created in those 3 field parameter tables. Is that better now?
Much better, much better. Thank you.
Right. So on this one here, so you've got the actual so the attribute value is coming from the customer column, and then I've got another row here where I'm bringing in the attribute value from the sale column. And so what I'm doing here, and then at the end of it, I'm just filtering it out. So I only want to filter out where the attribute value equals 1. So that'll then give me this table below here, where I've got a column called attribute value, and order. And this is the reason for having the distinct numbers in the order column, so I can link all my tables together within the data model. So if I go back to the actual data model itself, so if I show people the actual data model here, for the actual field parameters here, is that this row measure legend here is actually linked on that order number, which I've created, and is linking all the different tables together. You can actually link it on text values if you want. You can link it on other fields that you might want to create. I just happen to use that row order column because it gets created, and so I can then use that within my data model that I've actually got. So that's the setup of all the different tables, and that's how you end up with the data model that I got. And that's how, if I then take a look at back to this row legend, this is this attribute field that I was showing people earlier within the actual page itself. So I can then use that field now within my filter pane here. As I said, I can now use this attribute, and I actually can now use that sale, and it'll filter out all the particular measure, legend, and x-axis within the slices for that page. And so it's worked exceptionally easy to actually do that. So yeah, Nikos, that's correct, is that you can actually just use that one link table at the top, and that'll then filter down through your other options. Because at the end of the day is that if you don't want to end up with a situation, if you, for example, you might have the case where you end up having to, I've seen this in other reports, where you end up creating, 10 different field parameter tables because you've got a particular attribute around each one, whereas you could actually create a simple data model like that and just do this, and it'll make life a lot easier for maintenance purposes later on. So that's setting up that side of things. So any other questions that I've missed, Christy?
No, nothing else.
Okay, cool. So we get to now these dynamic titles. So this is the thing that we're talking about, selected values. So if I just go back to my page here. So one of the things that I've got here is that at the top here of my actual visual itself is that I've got the option here. The title is dynamic, and the measure definition that I was talking about earlier from that one table is also dynamic as well. So for example, is that I can actually select a different product category here, and my title will change on my visual. I could go and select the purchase month and purchase year, and my title will change to say order by product category and 2 or more x-axis row dimensions. I could also select another measure as well. Now what will happen is the measure definition that I've built into the subtitle will come up and just say definition will only be displayed when only one measure is selected. And so if I deselect that, that'll then display the definition of that particular metric if you've only selected one metric within the actual within the slicer. And so the other thing as well is that when it comes back to that, so this all comes down to the selected value issue. Now, one of the things, like I said, is that selected value will not work on that first column within the field parameters table that I was showing you earlier. So this is where, like I said, I created a calculated column and take it from there. Or, like I said, you can also use a combination of select columns, summarize, count rows, as well as concatenate X side of things on the auto-generated columns if you're wanting to try and use that, or as Nikos said, min max to do that. Now, the other thing as well is, like I said earlier, is this measure definitions table. If I go back to this one here, part of the reason why I created it as an extra table attached to the measure field parameters table is that I've actually got this table sitting in SQL. So I can actually go and update any of those definitions in SQL, do a refresh of the report in the service, and that definition will automatically be updated. Whereas I know you could, in actual fact, if you wanted to, go into each of the field parameters table and add another column in here for your definitions. So I could type in here as to, definition of measure if I wanted to. But then the challenge will come is that if you do that within your actual data model, is that what happens if somebody wants to make a tweak to that definition or something like that? You've then got to go into the data model, do the change, republish, etc. Whereas by having those definitions in a separate table sitting in SQL, you can much easier to go and edit that table of data and then just do a refresh of the report. So it makes life so it gives a little bit more independence to the actual report itself. So that's on the measure definition side. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do is that on this particular page, I wanted to take things to another level, that I wanted to be able to have the option of how can I actually, in this situation here, is that if I look at the number of orders here, is that I've just got absolute values in the particular matrix at the moment. But I wanted to try and look at it and see, okay, how can I actually convert those numbers to percentage of column within that actual matrix itself? So I wanted to have the ability to be able to switch between absolute values and percent of selected total side of things. So what I ended up doing was combining field parameters and calculation groups into the mix. So what I've got in this is a nice, very basic chart that I've got here, is where I've actually can select an x-axis row. I've actually brought onto this visual itself, I've actually got a calculation item that I've brought into this visual, so I can actually display the absolute value as well as the percent of the selected total for the different permutations that I've got on here. So one of the quirky things is that I've seen other instances where you might have to create a whole lot of measures to try and deal with all the different permutations that you've actually got with this, or that was the first iteration that I tried. And I'm one of those individuals that I'm not lazy. I'm trying to be efficient in terms of how I set all these up. So I thought, let me try the calculation group option. So how did I do that with the calculation group? So if I look at the first option here, which is looking at the actual how I set up with the matrix calculation group. So this one here, if I show people the absolute one here, if I just zoom into that, so that one is a very basic one, just absolute equals selected measure. If I go and look at the actual percent of selected total side of things, is that, so what I've got here is that I've got a variable at the top here, which is doing selected value of the x-axis row name, so that extra calculated column that I created. I'm also looking in here as well to find out what is the measure name that I've actually got in that visual, because the reason for that is that if I wanted to have dynamic titles in the visual itself, is that as soon as you add a calculation group or have a calculation group on a page that is going to interact with another visual, is that calculation group is going to impact every measure that is actually in that visual itself. Whereas if you try and do that on a title, your visual won't work. It'll break. And so what I wanted to do here is that I wanted to say, okay, I only want this calculation group to impact the measures that I actually want to create the percent of selected total on within that visual itself. So that's why I created that additional calculated column where I'm extracting the name of the measure from the actual measure fields column. And so when you actually extract that, what it'll do then is it'll go through the selected row, depending on what it's actually been selected in the slicer. If it's none, then just do a basic divide the selected measure side of things. So you're going to get 100% on that. If you're looking at the first purchase month, then please do this calculation for me based on the dim calendar purchase table, etc., for each of the different permutations. I know you have to add all the different permutations into the calculation group, but I find it's a hell of a lot easier than trying to think of every single permutation of dimension and measure that you may have to use within your visual. So that's setting up the calculation group for this particular visual. Now, I then decided, right, let's go to the next sort of setup, is where on this particular next page here is where I've actually got a slicer up at the top here where I actually want to switch the visual at the bottom, which is just a cluster column chart between absolute and percent of selected total. And so if I switch between the two, this will actually then just change over depending on what options I've actually selected in my on my slices on the left-hand side. And so it'll just change depending on what I'm wanting to do. And if I then change over to the percent of selected total, that'll then convert the visual into 100% column chart, basically. But you're actually being able to switch without actually having to use bookmarks on your page. So it's less overhead. Yes, there's overhead of creating the calculation group, but it's a lot easier to be able to do it this way than me having to use bookmarks to switch between the column chart and 100% column chart. Now, one of the things that you may have noticed is that the dynamic title up at the top here does take a couple of seconds when you switch across to the percent of selected total to render. So as soon as you change the actual the options on the actual x-axis, it'll actually take a couple of seconds to actually render. Now, one of the things that you will notice, the chart's gone blank, but there's a little message at the bottom here because it will go blank because I've selected marital status and marital status in both the legend and the x-axis, and I wanted to actually set it up that when that happens, it goes blank because it's actually meaningless in terms of actually looking at a chart because you just got 100% values for both options. So I set it up. There was a reason why I set it up that way. Now, in terms of the calculation group for this particular one, is I took a slightly different approach because I thought to myself, in the matrix version, if you look here at the matrix version, I've created each row and I've gone and created a DAX calculation for each of the different rows. Now, what will happen though is that there's some of these that are actually repeated. So, for example, these two here are repeated. So, first purchase month is based on the calendar purchase dimension table, and first purchase year is also coming from there. So, why can't I actually create variables for these particular options? Which is exactly what I did for the actual the column chart variation. So in here is that I've actually created variables at the top of the actual calculation item. So I've created one for calendar birth. So it'll create a value for that. So if any dimension that is related to that is selected, it'll then do that calculation, etc., for each of these different entities. So each of the different dimension tables that I've got referenced in the field parameters table, I've just created a different variable up at the top here. And then when you get further down here in my switch statement, is that I'm just referencing it here. So each of the different options, I'm just referencing the variables further up in the code. And so I've got a slightly simpler switch component, but I've obviously created all the variables up at the top here. So you can use both options and both ways work. So I've managed to get it to work this way, and it's much easier to actually be able to switch between the visuals, so which is exactly what I wanted to achieve on here. And I can still keep my dynamic titles as well, because I've got that that sort of clause in place in my calculation group to be able to stop it from impacting the calculation group, to stop it from impacting my title. And I could do exactly the same. Because of the way I've got it set up, I could still have my definitions as well here, but I thought I'd rather keep it simple and just stick to one title, just keep the title in. Any questions?
No,
at the moment.
Nothing else.
Great.
It was just Nico saying that it's really good to have the decoupled measure definitions in a SQL, and for me, it's also the most logical part.
Yeah. So one of the things to be careful of is that I haven't managed to get field parameters to work myself in AI visuals in the Q&A, and I know Microsoft say it's not supported. You cannot, when I say cannot use them in live connection mode, you can use them in live connection mode if the field parameters exist in the underlying semantic model. I need to actually change this to semantic model. So because you do need to have it in the underlying semantic model, and then your live reports will actually, live connected reports will actually work, and your field parameters will work. If you've got a composite model, you can also add the field parameters to the composite model, but be very careful of the composite model. Is one of the things that I found is that if you're trying to create, if for example, you join two separate models into your composite model and try and create a field parameters across both those data models, I haven't managed to get it to work. If I create field parameters off of just one of them, just one of the dimension tables from the one model, then I've actually got it to work. I haven't managed to get it to work across two different models itself. Also, too, you cannot use implicit measures. You'll need to create the explicit measures to be able to create the field parameters. And also, too, you cannot use it with Analyze in Excel as well. You can't use the field parameters. So that's one thing to be careful of if you're using it quite a lot to filter your data. One of the things I'm just going to sort of add on links at the end is linked to sort of field parameters from Microsoft Learn. I've also got a link here for the selected value function issue that Mark and Alberto wrote an article about. So you can go and read a bit more in depth into that if you want. And there's also a really good blog that Kurt on Data Goblins has done about measure selection. So there are other variations, because I know you can use calculation groups on their own to do measure switching if you want. You can also use, I think I saw it in the chat earlier, yes, previously you ended up having to create a disconnected table and a switch statement and do all sorts of weird jumping through the hoops, but you didn't get the flexibility that you get now with the field parameters. And the fact is that they hold their formatting as well, which is previously you couldn't hold the formatting. Yes, you've now got dynamic field formatting now built into Power BI, but previously you didn't have that option, and so you had some very weird stuff going on when you were trying to mix percentages and absolute values and things like that. So yeah, that's it. And to answer Bruno, yes, I'll send a copy of the PBEX over to Christy, and then he can upload it to GitHub and distribute a link around to people or do whatever from them.
Yeah.
So yeah, quite happy to do that. So I'm hoping, Nikos, that you actually did learn something, considering what you said earlier. So, but yeah, thanks very much, everybody.
Oh, any questions from the attendees?
No questions, only wow.
Yeah, exactly. I was.
I have a question. Can I?
Sure.
Sorry, I was not attending since start. I was not able, but I had a problem with field parameters. If I use a field parameter to select measures, and then I would like to use like DNAP custom visuals, then as soon as I switch the measure in a field parameter, the DNAP stops to operate because it is in fact fed by the former measure name and not by the like lambda function. So effectively, it rename the measure that it's inputting into the DNAP. Is it anyhow possible to create something like alias for that it's addressing the field parameters? Doesn't matter what is selected in the measure or in the value there.
I would say I don't know because I've never played with DNAP, but I haven't played with custom visuals. I've only played with the core visuals, but I'll have to play around and try and see, or do some research, and we'll drop you a shout out, Pavel, if we find out what way to actually try and get around that problem. Because like I said, I haven't used field parameters with custom visuals or DNAP, so I don't know.
Well, the topic is that if you study the DAX code for it and you just create a table, whatever is the evaluation context per row, and then the field parameter that is represented by measure A and measure B as kind of slicer through the measures, then if you study the DAX code for it, as soon as you switch the field parameter to measure A, effectively the DAX code works like there is no field parameter at all. The table, the DAX evaluation is the column that specifies the evaluation context and measure A. So there is no information about the field parameter. So if you'd like to somehow address the field parameter, like what is the selected value, what is the selected measure there, you are addressing the values of the measure, not the measure names, and you can't address them like dynamically. And I was not able to get over it.
Have you? I was just thinking, did you try with the extra calculated column in the field parameters?
Yeah.
Nope.
It might be a solution,
So
exactly like you showed it earlier.
Yeah,
You
so
can
within
add
here,
additional columns.
so with the additional calculated column that I created here, as to whether you could possibly get around it using that.
Okay. Thanks for the tip, and I'm sorry, I really missed the majority of your seems very wonderful presentation.
Okay, no, yeah. So basically, yeah. So Paul's saying here is that I have with icon map and had to create a workaround, the extra column will work.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a route. So when you create your field parameters table, if you came on a bit later, is that obviously within them you can edit them and you can go and add extra columns. So what I do is that I create a calculated column here, which is just the name of the first column which gets generated. Mm-hmm. And then that's the column that I actually use. So in my legend selection here, I'm actually using the selected value of the legend name column that I've created, not the original legend column.
Yeah, that's smart. Thanks. Good idea. Wonderful idea. Thanks you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, so that might be an option
Pavel.
around it.
It might work. Let us know in January if it worked or not.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if that works.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We are all learning.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, that's going to be my thing over Christmas.
Well, I see that Paul made it work, and it should work in another one. Yeah, there's another question from Pavel. Please, the recording, I'm really sorry. I will probably have it by Saturday evening, Pavel. Even if I have some backlog with four meetups, I had a really busy period the last month, and no time to edit the recordings. This one will be the first in line, so I will go the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be good, JP, to have Miguel Myers involved.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other question from the chat? I see lots of wow and thank yous, and as I said, we are all learning. Even if I saw the session before, I just learned something new, how to rename a column, a DAX column, even if it's not visible anywhere. And up until first time I saw your session, I was not even thinking to relate DAX tables created for field parameters. I was just doing 2 of them and using for a single visual, and that's it. I was not even thinking to do relationships between them.
And I found
Well,
it's been
you are
really
welcome,
useful.
Brian.
Christy has been really useful. Is like, you know, where I've seen, like I said earlier, I've seen reports where people have created multiple different field parameters just for that particular page of that report, and then create another one, and then another one, and then another one, another one. And we sort of go, well, just combine them all together and create a little mini data model. Yes, you just a little bit of a setup at the beginning, and off you go.
Yep. Well, as I said, field parameters are a really, really cool feature that helps a lot. And combining them with calculation groups, it's even better.
Nikos, what you need to do on the weeks, I managed to solve that issue, is that if you use another column in a table to sort your column by, it keeps the sort order. So, for example,
another
here,
ID column.
Yeah. So
could you please also read the question for the recording?
Yeah. So basically, for example, there was a question about Nikos was saying is that another issue comes up regularly, a sorting order being lost when using weeks, or for example, a text value within a visual. And so that can happen, is that if you're switching between dimensions, or especially dimensions, you switch between them, that you think, okay, great, I've got everything sorted from January through to December. You switch it to, say, a year, and the whole sort order of your visual then changes to go, 2010, then 2019, 2017, 2020, etc. Whereas if you go and actually sort that column by another column in the dimension table, it then, the sort order sticks within the actual visuals itself.
Yeah, first date of week.
Yeah.
So basically adding another sort of the sort column.
Yeah.
An ID of the sort column, something like this.
Yeah.
I have another tip for fields. I'm using it for multi-language reports, because the record is able to rename even the column names. The field is able to rename even the column names. So effectively, you create a subtable field as a field. You tinker with it a little with additional column. So there will be like Espanol and the column, whatever translation of the column into the Spanish. Another row is the English, an English column, German, Czech, etc. And you add the another like handmade, or if you even you use this order sorting stuff. And then you have one table that is slicing all these fields parameters. So effectively, if you select the Espanol, that it's number 3 in order of all the fields, then all the field parameters are sliced to Espanol only. And then if you use these fields into your tables, then you have the column there with the values, and the column itself is named into the Espanol.
Yeah.
That is
doing translations. Yeah, never thought about it.
I've seen that somewhere. Somebody had done that, and it was my next step was to actually try was to play around with that. was to actually use translations, because I've seen that being done before a while ago, and I thought, oh, I've got to try that out, because yeah, that must be really useful. So at least all your titles then will be in Spanish, and all your rows will be, in Spanish.
No, categories, something like this. Yeah,
the problem
idea,
is that you need a lot of these field parameter tables to use them properly, because you effectively need one field parameter for every column that should be like multi-language translated. So that's kind of cons of this approach.
But advantages and disadvantages.
But Pavel, I'd be intrigued to find out as to whether you could use this methodology of, one table, but with extra columns for the thing, to see whether you could actually do that way.
Yeah, I did so, but the problem is that as soon as you start to use the metrics visual to show the values, then it's very difficult to show different columns translated within the same field parameters. If you'd like to have like a hierarchy within the columns, like the master column and then the tier 2 values to be shown, then the field parameters start to do very spooky things.
Okay. No, I'm just intrigued behind that, because I would have thought that if I'm just going to duplicate this page so I don't mess up the rest of the stuff here. But I just thought is that if you, for example, on here where I'm filtering the page out by this particular attribute up at the top here, if I used a similar one, that instead of saying sales and customer, I had two different ones. One was saying English and one was saying French, well, for example.
That's true, but in my environment, I need to switch the language of the report from second to second, because typically I have multi-language audience, and some of these guys are fluent in English but not in German. So it's much better if the user itself can switch between the languages, and it's translated like on fly. I know that's kind of very specific niche of requests, but unfortunately in automotive company and German-owned car industrial sector, it's like this.
Interesting from what, I see that is interesting. There was a question from Nikos about performance issues with large data sets and having fancy setup with field parameters and things like that. Nikos, I'm not quite sure what sort of a large data set you're sort of what sort of that constitutes, but certainly in the reports that I've been working on with this setup here, some of the fact tables have got about 50 million rows of data in them, and I haven't hit any performance issues.
There can be performance issues if you use the data set with fields and you access this data set with fields via not a link, this combo access of Microsoft, that you are kind of not linked data set, not linked report, but this direct queried report to your data set, because then it's called
it's sending a query for every click.
Yeah, and the problem is that the sending of the query is using the same architecture as the field parameter. So effectively, if you have a field parameter, your efficiency just plummeted down for these hybrid data models. Be very careful there. That's kind of very, very, very small or very effective bottleneck for shared data set to other developers.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've never used direct query ever. I've only ever used live connection on stuff, or straight import on reports.
Yeah, 50 million rows is not that much.
Yeah, it's small. I sort of think large, and I'm hitting. I sort of large. I'm starting to think about sort of terabyte sort of.
Exactly. When I'm thinking about large data models, I'm always thinking about Chris Wade and his 2 trillion rows data model with clicky, draggy, droppy.
Yeah,
thing.
taxi, taxi data.
Yeah. Well,
Cool.
only good things in the chat. Thank you, Anthony. It was a really, really cool presentation. We've learned a lot. And we saw the flexibility of field parameters, especially when it's also combined with calculation groups. I loved it. It's really powerful. And thank you again for your presentation.
Pleasure, Christy. No, great. Yeah, always good.
We'll have a few more minutes for the Enterprise DNA Raffle, and let's see who is the winner. And as we are a Power BI user group, I'm using a Power BI report to display the spread of the attendees tonight that are participating. Let's see. Let's make a last refresh before the raffle itself. This is actually doing, it's the end of a flow, which start in the form that you filled up with a Power Automate. I took the data from the form and wrote them in a SharePoint, and then I've built this Power BI report based on the SharePoint list. And at the beginning, I had it's still here, but I'm using it only to write back to the SharePoint list. Power Apps. I used to get the random numbers with another flow inside Power Apps, but it's not working anymore. Anyway, for now, we have 13 answers and 11 participants. Let's see the participants. Transform data. And we'll go again with this one. Power Query to get the prepared data. These are the participants, just to make sure we have 11 here too. Okay. Copy and go to our wonderful wheel of names. But in order to be fully functional, just like before, let me stop sharing and reshare the screen with the sound, because I really like the drum roll sound when we are getting the answers. So 11 participants. Let's shuffle the names and see who is the first winner of an Enterprise DNA license for 1 year. Drum roll. Nikos from Greece, congrats. You are the first winner. See, you learned something new and you won an Enterprise DNA license. Let's shuffle again and get the second winner. Mihaela, congrats. You are the second winner. I will contact you both after the meetup to confirm your email addresses so I can register you in the Enterprise DNA raffle. Thank you all again for joining the last meetup of the year. Thank you, Anthony, again for your time and for sharing your knowledge. I'm wishing you all happy festive season, depending whether you are wherever you are in the world. Happy holidays and see you next year.